Mia Ashcroft felt her ankle give out the second her heel caught the edge of a broken curb, and by the time she registered the pain shooting up her leg, she was already down on one knee on the wet pavement, her portfolio of contracts scattering across the sidewalk like startled birds. Rain hammered against her back, soaking through the silk blouse she'd chosen that morning because it made her look sharp, in control. Exactly the kind of woman who didn't fall apart in front of strangers. She pressed her palm flat against the cold concrete and tried to stand. But the moment she put weight on her right foot, a white-hot bolt of pain forced a gasp out of her that she hated herself for making. 6 blocks from the office. 6 blocks from a meeting that could decide whether her father finally trusted her with something real instead of another decorative title. And here she was, crumpled on Lexington Avenue papers, drowning in a puddle, heel snapped clean off her shoe. She grabbed for the closest sheet of paper. Some clause about liability that suddenly felt like the least important thing in the world. And that was when she saw him. A man was walking toward her under the awning of a shuttered flower shop. A little girl balanced against his hip, her small arms locked around his neck, and her face tucked into his shoulder to hide from the rain. He wasn't hurrying the way most people did in weather like this, ducking and swearing and holding newspapers over their heads. He moved like someone who had made peace with getting wet a long time ago, like there were more important things to protect than himself. Mia watched him get closer, felt the absurdity of her own situation rising in her throat, and before she could stop herself, before pride could intervene the way it usually did, the words were already out of her mouth. "I'm so sorry this is humiliating, but can you carry me for a while? Just to the corner. I can't put weight on this ankle, and I don't think I can flag a cab looking like this." The man stopped walking. For a second, he just looked at her, rain running down the line of his jaw, and something flickered behind his eyes that Mia couldn't name. Something that looked almost like recognition, though she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. He had the kind of face that belonged in an office, not on a sidewalk with a toddler on his hip. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair cut short and neat, and an expression that seemed permanently guarded, like a man used to keeping his cards close. His daughter lifted her head from his shoulder and stared at Mia with wide, curious eyes, unbothered by the rain and the way only small children ever were. "Daddy, is the lady hurt?" the girl asked, and something in her father's posture shifted at the sound of her voice, softened in a way that made the guarded look in his eyes almost disappear. "She twisted her ankle, sweetheart," he said, and then to Mia, in a voice that was low and even careful, in a way that made her think he chose his words the way other people chose their outfits. "I've got Lily with me, so I can't exactly sprint, but I can get you to the corner. There's a pharmacy there, and you can sit down and figure out a cab from inside instead of out here." "Thank you." Mia breathed relief, hitting her harder than she expected. And when he crouched down slightly, offering his free arm, she looped hers through it and let him take some of her weight as she rose, wincing when her ankle brushed the ground. He was stronger than his lean frame suggested, steady in a way that made her feel instantly, embarrassingly safe. And as they made their slow, limping progress down the sidewalk, his daughter watching her the entire way with unblinking fascination, Mia found herself laughing, despite the pain. A short, disbelieving laugh at the absurdity of asking a total stranger to carry her weight through a rainstorm in the middle of a workday. "I promise I'm not usually this dramatic," she said, gripping his arm tighter as her heel caught again. "I had a meeting. I still have a meeting, actually, in about 12 minutes, which I am now going to attend looking like I fell into the East River." "You look fine," he said. And there was something in the flatness of his tone that told her he meant it as simple fact rather than flattery, which for some reason made it land harder than any compliment she'd received in months. Meetings survive worse than wet hair. "Not the meetings I have." Mia muttered more to herself than to him, and she caught the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close enough to notice. Lily, still perched on his hip, reached out one small hand and patted Mia's soaked sleeve as if trying to help dry it. And Mia felt something unexpected tighten in her chest at the gesture. An ache she associated with things she didn't let herself want too openly. David used to say meetings were just arguments with better lighting, the little girl announced, suddenly proud of herself for remembering. And Mia felt the man's arm go rigid beneath her hand. Just for a heartbeat. A stillness so brief she might have imagined it if she hadn't been holding on to him. "Who's David?" Mia asked, more out of politeness than real curiosity, expecting some old family friend. A grandfather, an uncle. "Nobody," the man said quickly, and then softer, correcting himself. "Someone I used to be friends with. A long time ago." There was a finality in the way he said it that closed the subject entirely, and Mia, sensing she'd stepped somewhere she wasn't invited, let it go, though she filed the strange flicker of tension away without quite knowing why it mattered. They reached the pharmacy awning a moment later, and he helped lower her onto the small bench near the entrance, gentle in a way that suggested practice, the kind of careful movement a man learned from handling something fragile every single day. "I'm Mia," she said, extending her hand once she was settled, feeling suddenly like she owed him more than a rushed introduction after he'd just hauled half her weight through the rain. "Daniel," he answered, shaking her hand briefly, his grip firm and quick, like he was already preparing to leave before the conversation could become anything more than what it needed to be. "This is Lily." "Thank you, Daniel," Mia said, and meant it more than the words probably conveyed, because there was something about the way he'd helped her without hesitation, without making her feel small for needing it, that stayed with her longer than she expected it to. "You didn't have to do that." "You asked," he said simply, shifting Lily higher on his hip as the rain began to ease into a fine drizzle. "That's usually enough." He turned to go, and Mia watched him walk away with his daughter's small hand now waving over his shoulder at her. And it wasn't until he disappeared around the corner that she realized she hadn't asked his last name, hadn't asked what he did for a living, hadn't asked anything at all beyond the immediate crisis of her ankle. She sat there a moment longer, the pharmacy's fluorescent light buzzing faintly above her, and pulled out her phone to call a car, still turning over the name Lily had said with such easy familiarity. David. It meant nothing to her. It was a common enough name that she had no reason to hold on to it, and yet something about the sudden tension in Daniel's arm when his daughter said it refused to fully leave her mind. 3 blocks away, in the back seat of a black car idling at a red light, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment longer than the traffic required. Lily now buckled safely beside him, humming to herself as she traced raindrops racing down the window glass. He hadn't expected to see her today. He hadn't expected to see any Ashcroft today, not on a sidewalk, not soaked and vulnerable, and asking him for help in a voice that held none of the cold precision he remembered from the boardroom photographs he'd studied for months. He had built an entire life around never being caught off guard by that name again, and in the span of 10 minutes, a woman who shared it had leaned her full weight against his arm and thanked him like he was simply a stranger who'd been kind to her, because that was all she believed him to be. He thought of the folder locked in his desk drawer, 6 years of quiet, patient work, of names and dates and signatures that didn't match what the official record claimed of a man who had once let the world believe David Whitfield was a thief so that his own son could remain untouched. He thought of his wife's face the night she left, exhausted past the point of caring, telling him she couldn't watch him drown under a reputation he didn't deserve while raising a baby on savings that dwindled a little more each month. He had rebuilt himself since then, piece by careful piece, until David Whitfield no longer existed anywhere except in the memories of the people who had destroyed him. "Daddy," Lily said, tugging his sleeve. "Was that lady nice?" "She was," Daniel said quietly, watching the light turn green, watching the wipers clear the glass in slow, rhythmic strokes. Are we gonna see her again? He didn't answer right away because he honestly didn't know. And because some quiet, unguarded part of him, a part he hadn't given permission to feel anything in years, hoped that the answer might be yes. The conference room on the 40th floor smelled like burnt coffee and cologne. And Mia sat at the far end of the table with her ankle propped on a spare chair, trying to look like a woman who commanded respect instead of one who'd hobbled in 20 minutes late with a scraped palm and a story she had no intention of telling anyone at Ashcroft Holdings. Her father sat at the head of the table, flipping through a folder with the kind of controlled irritation that had defined most of her childhood. And when he finally looked up at her, his eyes moved to her bandaged ankle without a flicker of concern. "You're late," Richard Ashcroft said, and it wasn't a question. "I fell," Mia answered, keeping her voice even, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an apology for something that had genuinely not been her fault. "It's handled. Everything about you needs to look handled, Mia. That's the job." He closed the folder and slid it toward her end of the table, the motion sharp and final. "This is the Whitmore acquisition. I want you sitting in on due diligence with the consulting team we brought in. Learn something instead of decorating the room for once." She swallowed the sting of the comment the way she'd trained herself to for years. Opened the folder and scanned the summary page, her eyes catching on the name of the outside firm brought in to handle financial verification. Cole Strategic Partners. A small, relatively new consultancy that had apparently impressed the board enough to earn a seat at a deal this size. She thought nothing of it until 2 days later, walking into the glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor for the first due diligence session, when she saw him standing at the head of the table, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a stack of financial statements arranged with obsessive precision in front of him. Daniel looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the recognition passing between them like something electric and unspoken. He recovered first, professional and composed in a way that made her wonder if she had imagined the flicker of surprise at all. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said, and the formality of it landed strangely after the easy way he'd said her first name in the rain 2 days earlier. "I didn't realize you'd be joining this session." "Neither did I until yesterday," Mia said, taking the seat across from him, aware of the way her pulse had picked up in a manner entirely unrelated to the acquisition documents in front of her. "Small world, Mr. Cole," he supplied. "Daniel Cole, right." She opened her folder, forcing her attention to the numbers instead of the memory of his arm steady beneath her hand. "Well, I suppose I owe you a proper thank you this time. Preferably one that doesn't involve me bleeding on a sidewalk." Something in his expression eased slightly. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of the joke. And for the next 2 hours, they worked through balance sheets and liability disclosures with the kind of focused efficiency that surprised her, given how distracting she found it to sit across from him. He was thorough in a way that went beyond professional diligence, catching a discrepancy in a subsidiary's reported revenue that the internal team had missed twice, and when he flagged it, quiet and precise, Mia found herself watching him with something closer to admiration than she was comfortable admitting. "You're good at this," she said once the meeting broke and the rest of the team filed out for lunch, leaving the two of them alone with the leftover coffee and scattered papers. "I've had practice," Daniel said, gathering his files into a neat stack, not elaborating further. And Mia noticed not for the first time how carefully he avoided saying anything about his own history. Every question she'd asked over the past 2 hours about his background had been met with a short, deflecting answer, redirected smoothly back toward the work in front of them. "How's Lily?" she asked instead, softening the moment. And this time his face changed completely, the guardedness dissolving into something warm and unguarded. "She's convinced you're a superhero who fell out of the sky," he said. She's been asking when we're going to see the lady from the rain again. Tell her the superhero says hello, Mia said, smiling. And for a moment the space between them felt less like colleagues navigating a business deal, and more like two people who had stumbled into something neither had expected. Over the following week, their paths crossed more than the acquisition strictly required, though Mia told herself each time that the reasons were purely professional. She stayed late one evening to compare notes on a contested valuation and ended up walking with Daniel to a small diner 2 blocks from the office because neither of them had eaten. And somewhere between the burnt coffee and the plate of fries they ended up sharing, the conversation drifted away from work entirely. He told her, carefully, about raising Lily alone, about the rhythm of school pickups and bedtime stories that had become the architecture of his life, though he said nothing about Lily's mother beyond a brief mention that she wasn't in the picture. Mia found herself telling him things she rarely admitted to anyone about the exhausting weight of being Richard Ashcroft's daughter, about the way every accomplishment felt borrowed unless her father personally validated it, about how she sometimes wondered if she'd ever earned anything in her life, or simply inherited it. You don't strike me as someone who needs anyone's approval, Daniel said, watching her over his coffee cup. And there was something steady and certain in the way he said it that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. You don't know me very well yet, she said, though the word yet slipped out before she could stop it, and she caught the way his eyes lingered on her a beat too long after she said it. It was 3 days later, in her father's private office on the top floor, that Mia witnessed something that would return to her later with far more weight than it carried in the moment. She'd come to drop off a signed document, and through the open door she overheard her father on the phone, his voice low and clipped in a way she rarely heard him use, reserved for conversations he didn't want anyone else to hear. I don't care how long it's been, Richard was saying. If that name resurfaces in any capacity, I want to know before it becomes a problem. David Whitfield's file was closed 6 years ago, and it stays closed. Mia stood frozen for a moment outside the door, the name catching in her memory with a strange, unplaceable familiarity, though she couldn't immediately place why it mattered. When her father noticed her standing there, his expression shifted instantly into something composed and unreadable, and he ended the call without explanation. Everything all right? She asked carefully. Old business, he said, waving a hand dismissively. Nothing that concerns you. Did you finish the Whitmore signatures? She handed over the documents and left, telling herself it was nothing some forgotten dispute from years ago, the kind of thing that surfaced occasionally in a company as old as Ashcroft Holdings. But the name stayed with her the rest of the day, tugging at the edges of her memory, until walking to her car that evening she finally placed it. Lily. The rain. David used to say meetings were just arguments with better lighting. She stopped mid-step on the sidewalk, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't fully explain, telling herself it was coincidence that David was common enough a name that it meant nothing, that her father's business had nothing to do with a single father she'd met by chance in the rain. She almost convinced herself of it entirely, until the following afternoon, when she stopped by Daniel's temporary office space at Cole Strategic Partners to drop off a revised document, and noticed for the first time a thin white scar running along the side of his right hand just below his knuckles, visible as he reached for the folder she offered. That's an interesting scar, she said, more out of idle curiosity than suspicion, and watched something flicker briefly across his face before he pulled his sleeve down slightly, an instinctive, almost defensive motion. Old accident, he said. Doesn't matter anymore. She let it go the way she'd let go of everything else, but that night, alone in her apartment, she found herself opening her laptop and typing the name into a search bar before she could talk herself out of it. David Whitfield. The search returned little. A handful of old, mostly scrubbed articles about a financial scandal at Ashcroft Holdings roughly 6 years earlier, An internal embezzlement case that had ended quietly, with no public trial, no photograph, just a brief mention of a former financial analyst dismissed for misconduct. She stared at the screen for a long time, the pieces not yet fitting together into anything coherent, but a small, persistent unease settling into her chest regardless. She closed the laptop before she let herself follow the thought any further, telling herself she was imagining connections that didn't exist, that her father's old business disputes had nothing to do with the man who had carried her through the rain and made her laugh over diner fries. But somewhere beneath the reassurance she gave herself, a quieter voice reminded her that Richard Ashcroft's calm, controlled anger on the phone the day before had sounded exactly like fear. And Mia Ashcroft had learned a long time ago that her father was rarely afraid of anything that didn't have the power to actually hurt him. Across town, Daniel sat in his apartment long after Lily had fallen asleep. The folder from his desk drawer open in front of him for the first time in weeks. 6 years of carefully gathered evidence spread across his kitchen table under the dim light of a single lamp. He traced his finger over a signature on an old internal memo, a signature that didn't match the handwriting samples he'd collected from the same period, proof buried under layers of corporate bureaucracy that had taken him years to piece together. He thought of Mia's face over dinner 2 nights ago, open and unguarded in a way he hadn't expected from an Ashcroft, and felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, a feeling that hadn't been part of the plan. He had built this entire operation with a single purpose: to expose the truth Richard Ashcroft had buried to protect his son, to reclaim the name that had been stolen from him and given to shame instead. He had never planned for Mia to be anything more than a means to information, a connection close enough to the family to eventually give him what he needed. But somewhere between the rain and the diner and the sound of her laugh over something as small as burnt coffee, that plan had begun to feel less like strategy and more like something he was no longer certain he wanted to see through to its original end. He closed the folder, slowly pressing his palm flat against the cover, and stared at the small drawing Lily had left on the table earlier. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a crayon sun. One of them unmistakably wearing a triangle-shaped dress and long yellow hair. "Who's this one, sweetheart?" he had asked her at dinner, though he already suspected the answer.
"That's the Rain Lady,"
Lily had said, proud of her work.
"She's part of our family now."
Daniel had said nothing in response, only smiled and told her it was beautiful. But long after she'd gone to bed, the drawing sat on the table like a quiet accusation, a reminder that whatever he was building toward it was no longer contained to the careful, controlled plan he'd spent 6 years constructing. The Whitmore acquisition dragged into its 3rd week, and with it came a rhythm Mia hadn't expected to grow so attached to. Late evenings spent cross-referencing figures with Daniel, easy dinners that stretched longer than either of them planned, Saturday afternoons that somehow, without either of them quite orchestrating it, came to include Lily. It was on one of those afternoons at a small park 2 blocks from Daniel's apartment that Mia found herself pushing Lily on a swing, while Daniel sat on a nearby bench pretending to review a contract he clearly wasn't reading, watching the 2 of them instead with an expression Mia caught only because she happened to glance back at exactly the right moment. "Higher," Lily demanded, and Mia obliged, laughing at the girl's delighted shriek, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been tight for as long as she could remember. Some old guarded part of herself that had learned early to keep people at a careful, manageable distance. She hadn't planned on letting a 4-year-old and her quietly watchful father dismantle that instinct so completely. But here she was, breathless and laughing in a public park on a Saturday afternoon, further from the version of herself that sat in boardrooms than she'd been in years. "You're good with her," Daniel said later, once Lily had tired herself out and fallen asleep against his shoulder on the walk back, her small hand fisted in the collar of his jacket.
"She's easy to be good with,"
Mia said, She doesn't want anything from me except swing pushes, and apparently my professional opinion on which crayon is the correct shade of purple. That's a real debate in our house, Daniel said, and Mia laughed. The sound easy and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. And when she glanced up at him, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch slightly. Something quiet and searching that neither of them acknowledged out loud. It should have stayed simple. That was what Mia told herself later, replaying the moment in her mind, trying to understand exactly when the ground beneath her had begun to shift. But 2 days after the park, standing outside a coffee shop near the office, waiting for Daniel to finish a call before their scheduled meeting, she watched a man approach him from across the street. Someone older, gray at the temples, dressed in a suit that suggested finance rather than casual acquaintance. And the moment the man got close enough to speak, Mia saw something happen to Daniel's face that she had never seen before. "David," the man said loud enough that Mia, standing several feet away, heard it clearly. "David Whitfield, is that you? God, it's been years. I heard you left the city entirely after everything with Ashcroft." Daniel's entire posture changed in an instant. Controlled and tight, his voice dropping into something low and urgent that Mia couldn't fully make out from where she stood, though she caught enough fragments. Mistaken identity, wrong person, must be thinking of someone else. The older man looked confused, apologized, and walked away, shaking his head. And by the time Daniel turned back toward the coffee shop, his expression had smoothed back into the composed, guarded look Mia had come to recognize as his default. But not before she'd seen the flash of something raw underneath it. "Who was that?" she asked once he'd rejoined her, keeping her tone light even as her mind raced back through every strange detail she'd collected over the past weeks without quite letting herself assemble them. Lily's mention of David, the scar he wouldn't explain, her father's tense phone call about a name he wanted buried. "Mistaken identity," Daniel said too quickly, reaching for his coffee like it might give him something to do with his hands. "Happens more than you'd think." Mia studied him for a long moment, and something in her chest tightened with a feeling she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite suspicion, but the uncomfortable awareness that the ground she'd been standing on with him wasn't as solid as she'd assumed. She let the moment pass, telling herself it wasn't her business, that everyone was entitled to a past they didn't want to discuss. But the unease followed her back into the office, sitting heavy in her stomach through the rest of the afternoon's meetings. That evening, her father summoned her to his office with the kind of curt phone call that never meant good news, and Mia arrived to find him standing at the window with his back to the door, a glass of scotch in his hand, despite the early hour. "I need you to pull back from the Whitmore deal," Richard said without turning around. "Why?" Mia asked, genuinely startled. "We're 3 weeks in. I've put in more work on this than anything else this year." "Because I said so," he said, finally turning to face her, and there was something in his expression she rarely saw. A tightness around his eyes that looked almost like fear, though she'd never once seen her father afraid of anything. "The consulting firm isn't a good fit for this deal. I want them off the account by end of week." "Cole Strategic Partners has been thorough and accurate," Mia said, carefully to keep her voice measured, even as something protective flared in her chest, something she didn't examine too closely. "They caught a discrepancy the internal team missed twice. I don't understand the objection." "You don't need to understand it," Richard said, his voice sharpening. "You need to trust that I have reasons." "What reasons?" Mia pressed something in her, refusing to simply accept the dismissal the way she always had before. "Is this about David Whitfield?" The silence that followed was so complete that Mia heard the ice shift in her father's glass, watched something pass behind his eyes that she'd never seen there before. Not anger, not irritation, but something closer to alarm, quickly smothered and replaced with practiced calm. "Where did you hear that name?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously even.
I overheard you on the phone last week, Mia said, choosing honesty because she sensed somehow that this was a moment that mattered more than she yet understood. You sounded worried. I've never heard you sound worried about anything.
It's an old employee matter, Richard said, turning back toward the window, his shoulders rigid. Ancient history. It has nothing to do with you, and it certainly has nothing to do with the consulting firm. Drop it, Mia. I mean that. She left his office with more questions than she'd walked in, with the unease from the coffee shop earlier settling into something heavier, more insistent. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself back on her laptop, digging deeper than she had before, searching not just David Whitfield's name, but cross-referencing it with old internal Ashcroft Holdings press releases from 6 years earlier. She found a brief mention in an archived local business journal, a short paragraph about a financial analyst let go amid allegations of misconduct. No further details, no follow-up story. The kind of clean, quiet erasure that only happened when someone with real power wanted a story to disappear. She stared at the screen for a long time, then almost without deciding to, pulled up the employee directory archive she still had access to through her father's old assistant, searching the name David Whitfield against Ashcroft Holdings personnel records from that period. A single photo appeared, grainy and small, an ID badge photo from 6 years earlier. A younger man with the same sharp cheekbones, the same guarded set to his jaw. Unmistakably, impossibly, Daniel. Mia sat back from her laptop, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with the sick, sinking realization spreading through her chest. Every strange moment of the past 3 weeks rearranged itself instantly into a different shape entirely. The scar he wouldn't explain, Lily's slip of the tongue. The stranger who'd called him by a name he denied. Her father's tense, fearful phone call. She thought of every dinner, every conversation, every moment in the park watching him watch her, and felt something crack open inside her chest that she didn't yet have words for. Betrayal, tangled together with something that still infuriatingly resembled hope, that there was an explanation that made this less than what it looked like. She didn't sleep that night. She sat with the photograph glowing on her screen until the sky outside her window began to lighten, turning the same questions over and over without landing on anything that felt like solid ground. Why had he lied? Why had he let her get close, let his daughter draw pictures of the 3 of them together, let her believe in something that apparently had another name entirely hiding underneath it? And beneath all of it, quieter, harder to look at directly. Why did some part of her still want to believe there was a version of this story where none of that mattered? Across the city, Daniel sat awake in his own apartment for entirely different reasons, the encounter outside the coffee shop replaying in his mind with an intensity that refused to fade. He had spent 6 years perfecting his ability to remain unshaken by moments like that, learning to redirect, to deflect, to bury the flash of old grief that came with hearing his real name spoken aloud by someone who remembered the man he used to be. But watching Mia's face in the seconds after, the flicker of something too sharp to be simple curiosity had unsettled him more than the encounter itself. She was closer to the truth than she realized, closer than his careful plan had ever accounted for. And for the first time since he'd begun this entire operation, Daniel found himself uncertain whether he was more afraid of being discovered or of what it would cost him when he was. He pulled the folder from its drawer again, running his thumb along the edge of the worn manila cover, and thought of Lily's crayon drawing still taped to the refrigerator. 3 figures holding hands beneath a careless yellow sun. Whatever came next, he understood now with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his chest, was no longer something he could fully control. Mia arrived at Daniel's office before he did, letting herself into the small consulting suite with the spare key she'd been given weeks earlier for late-night document exchanges, a gesture of trust that felt almost obscene to her now, sitting there in the dark with a printed copy of the old ID photo in her lap. She had spent the entire morning rehearsing what she would say, discarding a dozen different openings, none of them capturing the size of what she felt, until finally she gave up trying to script it and simply waited. The office quiet except for the hum of the building's ventilation and the distant sound of traffic below. He came in a little after 9, unbuttoning his coat, and stopped the instant he saw her sitting behind his desk. Something in his expression shifting immediately from surprise to a wary, careful stillness that told her more than anything else could have that he already sensed what this was. "Mia," he said slowly. "You're here early. I know who you are," she said, and watched the words land on him like a physical blow. Watched him go completely still in the doorway, his hand still resting on the collar of his coat. "David Whitfield. I saw your employee photo from 6 years ago. I know it's you." The silence stretched long enough that Mia almost filled it herself, almost gave him an escape route the way she'd given him a dozen small ones over the past weeks, telling herself his evasions were just privacy, just old wounds he wasn't ready to share. But she made herself sit with the silence this time, made herself wait until he answered, because she deserved that much after everything. "Yes," Daniel said, finally closing the door behind him with quiet, deliberate care, as if the sound of it clicking shut might somehow soften what came next. "I'm David Whitfield. I changed my name 6 years ago after your father's company destroyed my career and my marriage. And I built Cole Strategic Partners specifically to get close enough to Ashcroft Holdings to prove what he did." Mia felt the confirmation settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through every memory of the past 3 weeks, poisoning them one by one. "So none of it was real," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The park, dinner, Lily's drawings. It was all just a way to get information out of me." "It started that way," Daniel admitted, and the honesty in it somehow hurt worse than a denial would have. "I won't lie to you now, not after everything. I took the Whitmore contract specifically because I knew it would put me in proximity to your family. I intended to use whatever access that gave me. That was the plan from the beginning." "And what changed?" Mia asked, though some small stubborn part of her almost didn't want to hear the answer, afraid of how badly she wanted it to be something that redeemed the past 3 weeks, instead of confirming they'd been a calculated performance from start to finish. "You did," Daniel said quietly. "I didn't expect to actually care about you. I didn't plan for Lily to draw you into our family before I'd even decided whether I was going to tell you the truth. I've spent 6 years building toward this moment, and somewhere in the middle of it I stopped being certain I wanted it the way I used to." "That's convenient," Mia said, the anger finally breaking through the numbness, sharp and bright. "A man spends weeks lying to me, using his own daughter's affection as part of the performance, and now he wants me to believe he had a change of heart? Right on schedule, right as I was about to find out on my own." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly for the first time, some of his careful control slipping. "I'm telling you the truth because you deserve it, not because I think it fixes what I did. Your father destroyed my life, Mia. He let the board believe I embezzled funds I never touched, so his own son wouldn't face the consequences for what he actually did. I lost my job, my reputation, my marriage. My wife left because she couldn't watch me drown in the scandal I didn't create. And she left our daughter with me because she said she couldn't be the mother Lily needed while carrying that weight too. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? Watching everything be taken from you because someone more powerful decided your life was an acceptable price for protecting his own. Mia flinched at the rawness in his voice, the grief that had clearly been sitting beneath his composed exterior for years. But she forced herself not to soften, not yet, not until she understood everything. "Prove it," she said. "If my father did what you're claiming, show me the evidence. I've spent my whole life defending him because I believed he was hard but fair. If you're telling the truth, I need to see it for myself." Daniel walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the office, retrieved a thick folder, and set it on the desk in front of her without a word. Mia opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady and found page after page of internal memos, forensic accounting reports, handwriting analyses, comparing signatures on falsified documents to authenticated samples of her brother's handwriting. Financial trails that traced misappropriated funds not to Daniel's accounts, but to a series of shell entities connected to Marcus Ashcroft, her younger brother, who had been 23 at the time and, according to the documents in front of her, had gambled away nearly $2 million of company funds through accounts he'd falsified under Daniel's name. "My brother," Mia said quietly, the words tasting like ash. "This says Marcus did this." "Your father found out before it became public," Daniel said, his voice softer now, watching her carefully. "He had a choice. Let his son face criminal charges and public disgrace, or find someone convenient to blame. I was young, ambitious, easy to isolate, easy to discredit. He chose the option that protected his family name and destroyed mine instead." Mia sat with the folder open in her lap, flipping through page after page of evidence that dismantled everything she'd believed about her father, about the family she'd spent her entire life trying to earn a place in. She thought of every dinner where her father had spoken about integrity like it was a birthright of the Ashcroft name, every lecture about the weight of their reputation, every moment he'd made her feel like she hadn't yet proven herself worthy of the legacy he protected so fiercely. All of it built, she now understood, on a foundation of a lie he'd constructed to save the son he'd always favored, at the cost of a stranger's entire life. "Why didn't you go to the authorities with this?" she asked, looking up at him. 6 years and you never tried to clear your name publicly?" "I tried in the beginning," Daniel said. "Your father is careful. He buried the original personnel file, paid off the 2 people who might have corroborated my account, and made it very clear through people who worked for him that pursuing it further would end badly for me and for Lily. I stopped trying to fight it in the open and started building something quieter instead. I told myself once I had enough evidence, once I could prove it beyond any doubt, I'd find a way to bring it forward that he couldn't bury again. And I was supposed to be part of that plan," Mia said, the anger returning, quieter now, but no less real. "A way in. A source close enough to the family to give you what you needed." "Yes," Daniel said, refusing to soften the truth even now. "That's exactly what you were supposed to be. I won't pretend otherwise. But somewhere along the way, that stopped being the only reason I wanted to see you. And I think you know that, even if you don't want to admit it right now." "Don't," Mia said, standing up so quickly the folder slid off her lap, papers scattering across the floor between them. "Don't tell me what I know. You spent weeks constructing a version of yourself specifically designed to make me trust you, to make your daughter's affection feel like proof of your sincerity. And now you want credit for eventually feeling something real underneath the performance? That's not honesty, Daniel. That's just a more sophisticated kind of manipulation."
"Maybe it is," Daniel said, and something in the quiet defeat of his voice made her chest ache despite everything.
"I don't have a version of this where I come out looking blameless, Mia. I used you, and I hate that I did, because somewhere in the middle of using you, I fell in love with you. And now I don't know how to separate the two things enough to make either of us believe the part that was real."
Mia stood frozen for a long moment,
The word love landed in the wreckage between them with an impact that felt almost cruel in its timing, arriving exactly when she had the least capacity to trust it. "I need to go," she said finally, gathering the scattered papers back into the folder with hands that shook slightly, unwilling to leave the evidence behind, unwilling to let it disappear again the way her father had made everything else disappear for 6 years. "Mia," Daniel said as she reached the door, and something in his voice made her pause despite everything. "Whatever you decide to do with what's in that folder, I need you to know Lily adores you. That part was never a performance. She talks about you like you're already part of her life. And I don't know how to explain to a 4-year-old why the Rain Lady might not come back." "That's not fair," Mia said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. "No," Daniel agreed quietly. "It isn't. None of this has been fair to anyone, including her. I'm sorry for that more than anything else." Mia left without responding further, walking out into a hallway that felt too bright and too loud after the weight of the conversation behind her. The folder clutched against her chest like something that might combust if she let her grip loosen. She sat in her car in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive, replaying every piece of evidence, every carefully constructed memo, every signature that didn't belong to the man who'd been blamed for it. And beneath the fury and the grief, a colder, more practical question began to surface. What was she going to do with what she now knew? She drove not to her own apartment, but to her father's house, letting herself in with the key she'd carried since childhood, finding him in his study exactly where she expected. A glass of scotch already at his elbow, despite the early hour, as though some part of him had been waiting for this conversation to arrive. "I know about Marcus," Mia said, setting the folder down on his desk without preamble. "I know what you did to David Whitfield to protect him. I have the evidence, all of it. Forensic accounting, handwriting analysis, everything." Richard Ashcroft looked at the folder for a long moment, and something in his face crumpled slightly. The composed authority she'd known her entire life giving way to something older and more tired than she'd ever seen in him. "Sit down, Mia," he said quietly. "There are things you don't understand about that time, about the position I was in." "Then explain them," Mia said, remaining standing, refusing to be softened by the sudden fragility in his voice. The same voice that had spent years telling her she hadn't yet earned her place in this family. "Because from where I'm standing, you destroyed an innocent man's entire life, drove his wife away, left his daughter to grow up without a mother. Also, Marcus could avoid consequences for something he did at 23. I want to understand how you live with that." Richard was silent for a long time, staring down into his glass. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual command. "Every day," he said. "I live with it every single day. And I tell myself it was necessary, that protecting this family was worth the cost. I'm not certain anymore that I believe that. But I don't know how to undo 6 years of a lie this large without destroying everything I built to protect in the first place." "You're going to find a way," Mia said, her voice hard now, certain in a way she hadn't been certain of anything in years. "Because I'm not going to let this stay buried. And I'd rather you make it right on your own terms than have it forced out of you when Daniel finally decides he's tired of waiting for you to do the right thing." Richard Ashcroft did not sleep that night, and neither did Mia, though they sat in separate houses, turning over the same impossible weight. The folder now resting on the desk between father and daughter, like an accusation neither of them could look away from for long. By morning, Richard had made a decision, though it took him another 2 days of pacing his study, of drafting and discarding statements, of calling his lawyer, only to hang up before the man answered, before he finally summoned the courage to act on it. He called a meeting of the full board, something he hadn't done outside of quarterly obligations in years. And when Mia arrived at the office that morning, uncertain what she would find, she discovered her father standing at the head of the same conference table where she'd sat through countless due diligence sessions, with Daniel looking older than she'd ever seen him look. A copy of the folder placed deliberately in front of each board member's seat. 6 years ago, Richard began, his voice steady despite the visible effort it cost him. I made a decision that protected my son at the expense of an innocent employee's career and reputation. David Whitfield did not embezzle funds from this company. My son Marcus did, and I falsified records and pressured witnesses to ensure the blame fell elsewhere. I am telling you this because the truth is going to come out one way or another, and I would rather this board hear it from me with full documentation than watch it unravel in a way I can no longer control. The room went silent in a way Mia had never witnessed in any meeting she'd attended. The kind of silence that carried real consequence. Board members exchanging glances, someone's pen clattering softly against the table as it slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers. Mia watched her father speak, watched him accept questions he clearly had no comfortable answers for, watched the slow, visible cost of finally telling the truth after 6 years of carefully maintained silence, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel toward him again. A reluctant, complicated flicker of respect. Buried beneath everything else, she still couldn't forgive. The fallout moved quickly once it started. Marcus, confronted with the evidence and the board's demand for accountability, admitted to the falsified accounts within a day. His composure crumbling faster than Mia expected from the brother who had always coasted through consequences on the strength of their father's protection. He didn't go to prison, the statute of limitations on some of the underlying charges having lapsed, and the company choosing restitution and quiet resignation over the spectacle of a criminal trial that would have dragged the Ashcroft name through years of litigation. But he lost his position on the board entirely. Lost the trust fund oversight he'd managed for years, and was required, as part of the board's settlement terms, to personally fund a substantial restitution payment to David Whitfield, along with a public retraction of the original embezzlement claims filed with the same regulatory bodies that had accepted them 6 years earlier. Richard resigned as CEO within the week, stepping down not because the board forced him out entirely. Several members had argued for leniency given his decades of otherwise legitimate leadership, but because he insisted on it himself, telling the board and later telling Mia that he no longer trusted his own judgment enough to lead an institution that depended on integrity he'd so thoroughly failed to uphold when it mattered most. He remained on as a non-voting advisor, a diminished role that cost him visibly. And Mia watched him adjust to it with a kind of humility she'd never once associated with her father, though she remained wary of how much of it was genuine and how much was simply the performance of consequence he thought she wanted to see. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Richard told her one evening, weeks into the restructuring, the two of them sitting in his study with considerably less scotch between them than their last conversation there. "I know that's not something I can ask for and expect to receive. I just want you to know that I understand now what it cost someone else so that Marcus could avoid facing what he did. I understand it because I watched you look at me the way David Whitfield probably wanted to look at me for 6 years, and I deserved every bit of it." "I don't know if I forgive you," Mia said honestly, because she had promised herself she would stop performing certainty she didn't feel, a habit she was still unlearning after a lifetime of trying to be exactly what her father needed her to be. "I don't know if that's something that happens quickly or if it happens at all. But I'm glad you told the truth. That matters, even if it doesn't undo what you did." She hadn't spoken to Daniel since the morning she'd walked out of his office with the folder pressed against her chest, though she'd heard through the careful channels of the board's public statement and later through a brief, formal letter of retraction sent to every outlet that had ever run the original story that his name had finally been cleared publicly and unambiguously. 6 years of quiet erasure undone in the space of a single press release. She told herself the silence between them was necessary, that she needed time to sort through what had been real and what had been strategy, that loving someone who had spent weeks lying to her, however sympathetic his reasons, wasn't something she could simply decide to feel again once the facts were sorted out. But she thought about him constantly, in ways that frustrated her in the middle of meetings, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the sudden ache that hit her every time she passed a park and saw a small girl on a swing being pushed by a patient parent. She thought about Lily most of all, about the drawing Daniel had mentioned, 3 figures holding hands beneath a crayon sun, and wondered, with a guilt she couldn't quite shake, what it had cost a 4-year-old to be told, in whatever careful words her father had found, that the rain lady might not be coming back. It was nearly a month after the board meeting that Mia found herself standing outside Daniel's apartment building on a Saturday afternoon, having driven there without entirely deciding, to some restless, unresolved need finally overriding the careful distance she'd maintained since the confrontation in his office. She stood at the entrance for a long time before pressing the buzzer, and when Daniel's voice came through the intercom, cautious and slightly surprised, she almost lost her nerve entirely. "It's me," she said. "Can I come up?" He buzzed her in without hesitation, and when she reached his door, he was already standing in the open doorway. Lily, peering curiously around his legs, her face lighting up the instant she recognized Mia. "The rain lady," Lily announced, delighted, and launched herself forward to wrap her small arms around Mia's legs before either adult could respond. And Mia felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly at the unguarded warmth of it crouching down to hug the girl properly. Something in her chest loosening at the simple, uncomplicated joy on Lily's face. "Hi, sweetheart," Mia said, her voice thick. "I've missed you." "Daddy said you might not come back," Lily said, pulling away slightly to study Mia's face with the direct, unfiltered scrutiny only small children seemed capable of. "But I told him you would, because superheroes always come back." Mia looked up at Daniel over Lily's head and found him watching her with an expression that held equal parts hope and careful restraint, clearly unwilling to assume anything after the way they'd left things a month earlier. "Can we talk?" Mia asked, straightening up, and Daniel nodded, calling gently for Lily to go play in her room for a few minutes while the grown-ups spoke. A request the girl accepted with only minor protest, dragging her feet theatrically before disappearing down the hall. "I heard about your father," Daniel said once they were alone, gesturing for her to sit on the small couch in his living room. "The retraction, the resignation. I appreciate what that must have cost you, forcing that into the open." "I didn't do it for you," Mia said, though the words came out gentler than she intended. "I did it because it was the truth, and because I couldn't keep pretending my family's reputation was worth more than your 6 years, or Lily growing up without knowing you as anything other than exactly who you are." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I'm still grateful, whatever the reason. I've spent the last month trying to figure out what I actually feel." Mia continued, forcing herself through the words she'd rehearsed a dozen different ways on the drive over, none of which had felt adequate once she was actually sitting across from him. "I understand why you did what you did. I even understand why you didn't tell me the truth right away, given everything my father was capable of. But understanding it doesn't automatically undo the fact that for weeks, I believed I was building something real with someone who was, at least at first, using me to get information." "I know that too," Daniel said, not flinching from it, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "I don't have a way to make that not true. I can only tell you that somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped being able to separate the plan from what I actually wanted. And by the time I realized that, I didn't know how to tell you without losing you entirely. Which I suppose I did anyway for a little while." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Mia asked. before I found the photograph myself. You had opportunities. That night at the diner, the day at the park. You could have told me the truth and let me decide what to do with it instead of letting me find out on my own.
Because I was a coward, Daniel said simply, the admission clearly costing him something. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting Lily, protecting the plan I'd spent 6 years building. But the truth is, I was afraid that if I told you myself, you'd leave immediately. And some selfish part of me wanted to hold on to what we had for just a little longer before that happened. I'm not proud of that. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. And I didn't.
And I understand if that's not something you can simply move past. Mia sat with that for a long moment, watching him, weighing the honesty of it against everything else she'd learned about him over the past 2 months. The careful, guarded man who'd nonetheless carried her through the rain without hesitation, who'd raised his daughter alone with a gentleness that had never once felt performed, who had spent 6 years fighting quietly for a truth that could have destroyed him if he'd been caught pursuing it too aggressively.
I'm not going to pretend the lying doesn't matter, she said finally. It does. It's going to take time before I trust that easily again with you, or probably with anyone. But I also don't think I want to walk away from this, pretending I don't feel anything real, because I do, and pretending otherwise feels like its own kind of lie.
What are you saying? Daniel asked, something cautious and hopeful moving across his face. I'm saying I want to try, Mia said. Slowly. Honestly this time, with nothing left unsaid between us. I want to know Lily without wondering what part of it is real. I want to know you the same way. But I need you to understand that trust isn't something you get back just because the plan is finished and the truth is out. It's something you rebuild carefully, one honest conversation at a time.
I can do that, Daniel said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable, though he kept himself carefully restrained, clearly aware this wasn't a moment for grand gestures, but for the quieter, harder work of actually earning something back. I'd rather have that than pretend everything is fine and lose you slowly to something we never actually addressed. They sat together for a while longer, the conversation gradually easing into something softer, less fraught. And when Lily eventually reappeared, unable to contain her patience any longer, demanding to know if Mia was staying for dinner, both adults found themselves laughing at the shameless, transparent hope on her small face.
I could stay for dinner, Mia said, glancing at Daniel for confirmation, and the smile he gave her in response, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him since before she'd learned the truth, told her everything she needed to know about where they stood.
The months that followed weren't simple, and Mia was grateful, in a strange way, that they weren't. There were difficult conversations, moments where old wounds resurfaced without warning, an evening several weeks in where Mia found herself suddenly furious all over again, replaying the coffee shop encounter, the mistaken identity story, the small daily deceptions that had built the foundation of their early weeks together. And Daniel sat with her through the anger, without flinching from it, without trying to rush her past it, toward reconciliation before she was ready. Trust rebuilt itself in small, deliberate increments, in the way he began telling her things before she had to ask, in the way she stopped searching his face for hidden motives every time he was quiet, in the slow, patient accumulation of ordinary, honest days that gradually outweighed the extraordinary dishonest ones at the beginning. Her relationship with her father remained similarly complicated, neither fully repaired nor entirely severed. Richard settling into his diminished role at the company with a humility that occasionally struck Mia as genuine, and occasionally still felt like careful self-preservation, though she found with time that she no longer needed to resolve that uncertainty completely in order to maintain a relationship with him. Marcus, for his part, remained mostly absent from family gatherings, unable or unwilling to face the sister who now knew exactly what he'd allowed an innocent man to suffer for his own mistakes. And Mia found she didn't particularly miss his presence, a realization that surprised her less than she expected. 6 months after the board meeting that had unraveled 6 years of carefully constructed silence, Mia stood in Daniel's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, watching Lily carefully decorate a cake with far more frosting than any reasonable recipe called for, while Daniel worked beside her cleaning up a mess before it had fully happened. His movements easy and familiar in a way that no longer felt like something she was cautiously testing, but simply like home. "You know," Daniel said, glancing at her over Lily's head. "She's been asking when you're going to move your toothbrush here permanently, instead of pretending it's a coincidence that it's always in the bathroom. Is that an invitation, or is your daughter negotiating on your behalf again?" Mia asked, raising an eyebrow, though her chest felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the oven heat filling the kitchen. "Both, probably," Daniel admitted. "I've learned not to underestimate her negotiating skills. But if you're asking whether I mean it too, yes. I want you here, Mia. Not because of anything I need from you, not because of any plan or strategy left over from before, just because I can't imagine building the rest of this life without you actually in it." Mia looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once carried her through the rain as a stranger, and had since become something far more permanent, at the careful, deliberate way he'd rebuilt trust between them, one honest day at a time, and felt something settle fully into place inside her chest. Something she'd spent her entire life afraid to trust, because it had always felt too easily taken away. "Ask me properly sometime," she said, smiling. "Not through a 4-year-old's cake negotiations. But yes, I want that too." Lily, apparently sensing the shift in the conversation, despite understanding none of its specifics, held up the cake with triumphant pride, frosting smeared unevenly across half its surface, and a crooked, hand-drawn sun piped clumsily across the top in yellow icing. "I made the Rain Lady's sun," she announced, "because now it doesn't have to rain anymore." Daniel laughed, pulling his daughter into a hug that smudged frosting across both their faces, and Mia watched them together. This small, imperfect family that had begun with a desperate question on a rain-soaked sidewalk and had somehow, against every careful plan and hidden agenda, found its way toward something real. She thought of her father still working through his own slow reckoning of Marcus absent and unresolved, of the 6 years Daniel had spent fighting quietly for a truth that could have cost him everything, and understood finally that none of it had followed any plan either of them had originally intended, and that the story had turned out better for it. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, frosting and all, and let herself simply exist in the ordinary, unguarded warmth of a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, no longer carrying anyone else's weight, no longer performing a version of herself designed to earn someone else's approval, simply present in a life she had chosen, honestly, one difficult, deliberate day at a time.